This is Duke University.
Welcome to Fuqua and our final Distinguished Speaker Series of the year. My name is Hank Woods. I'm the Associate Dean for Development and Alumni Relations here at the school. It is my distinct pleasure today to introduce our speakers, Dean Bill Boulding, who most of you know, and David Rubenstein, who is the co-founder and co-CEO of the Carlyle Group, one of the world's largest private equity firms. Many of you have probably heard of some of David's works. He's a Trinity 70 graduate of Duke University, as well as a law school graduate at the University of Chicago in 1973. He has had a distinguished career in law and policy before founding the Carlyle Group in 1987. Needless to say, he's had a tremendous success in his business career, but is perhaps as well known for his many philanthropic endeavors, many of which you will see around the Duke campus. He is presently the chair of the Board of Trustees and is also co-chairing Duke's $3.25 billion Duke Forward initiative, which just surpassed the $2 billion mark. His many philanthropic endeavors outside of Duke are far too long to list here. I will give you a personal anecdote. Like many of you who have families, I took my 2 young daughters and my wife to Washington just a few years ago. And after we had been to the Washington Monument, the National Archives, and the National Zoo, my then 13-year-old turned to me and said, "Dad, who is this Rubenstein guy?" Needless to say, if you've been to the nation's capital, you've been the beneficiaries of his generous support of many different initiatives. I was pleased to know, and Mr. Rubenstein, thank you, when I told my 14-year-old now that I was introducing you today, she said, "Dad, that's really cool." Those of you with teenage daughters, you know that's a hard thing to do. Thanks so much.
It is really cool that David is here with us today. David is one of the most knowledgeable people on an incredible range of subjects that you could ever hope to encounter, as well as being wickedly funny. He is an expert in private equity and politics and panda pornography, and that's just the P's. So David, we really are happy to have you here, and just to give you some sense of where I want to go, I want to talk about different points in your life, and it seems like there's some magic numbers, 17, 27, 37, okay. And then it all breaks down from there. But let's start with 17. So you, what I'm really after here is trying to get some insight into where do some of these personal characteristics come from. So if we looked at your high school yearbook and we looked at the person who was voted most likely to succeed, would we find your picture?
Well, I was an editor of the yearbook, so it was a little unfair because I promoted myself a little bit more than maybe I should have. But no, I grew up in very modest circumstances. I'm from Baltimore, and my parents graduated from no college or no high school. My father dropped out of high school to go into World War II and came back, met my mother. They got married when he was 20, she was 17. I was born more than 9 months later. And, my father worked in the post office his entire life, and he made $7,000 a year at the maximum. So I went to a large public high school, and it was, and I skipped a grade or so, so I made a mistake of graduating from high school when I was 16, which is not a good thing to do, I think, generally, and probably was socially awkward, among other things. And I wasn't a great athlete, among other things. But so my yearbook would not have had me as the most likely to succeed, nor would my college yearbook at Duke. I would have been among the least likely people in my class to have been on the Board of Trustees or ever become chairman of the board. And so recent years, I've met people who were the stars of my college class, and I've looked at their careers, and they look at me and they say, like, how did you do this? Because you weren't that impressive when I knew you. when I came to Duke because I needed a scholarship. Whoever gave me the biggest scholarship, that's where I was going. And I came here, Duke gave me what was then a big scholarship, and the tuition was then $1,000 a semester. Is it about that high now or something like that, right? About $1,000 a semester, and so I got a scholarship, came here, and it was a different campus. To be honest, at the time, in my class, there was a quota of Jews. Duke had a Jewish quota in those days, about 5%. I didn't know it at the time, and it wasn't known until Terry Sanford came in, and he changed it later before I graduated. And they had just desegregated a few years earlier. So in my entire class of undergraduates, there were 12 African Americans, and less than 5% people were Jewish. I had gone to a high school which was half black and half Jewish. Came here and was a little different. And I just didn't find it as welcoming as I had wanted it to be. But I realized that in life you have to take advantage of the opportunities you get. And I had a scholarship, so I just buckled down and did the best I could. And I was never invited to join a fraternity. I didn't have the money to join one. My son is an undergraduate here now, and I've told him I want him to join a fraternity called Phi Beta Kappa, but he doesn't seem as interested in that one. So I basically hung out at the library, and my theory was to get the best grades you can and get the best scholarship to law school. In those days, I was interested in being a lawyer. And to be honest, just to not really quite answer your question, but what happened was when I was in the 6th grade, I had a life-changing experience. I watched a television show that was the inauguration of John F. Kennedy, January 20th, 1961. And he gave a speech that was 14 minutes in length. And he said in his famous speech, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." And my teacher in the 6th grade went over that for a week with us, every word, every line in this really poetry in prose form. And it stuck with me that I wanted to help my country, and I didn't think making money wasn't a great thing. It wasn't on my horizon. My parents had no money, and they didn't think about it. So I wanted to be a lawyer and go into government and politics and basically try to change the country from being a government official. And so when I went to law school, my real goal in life was not to make money, got into private equity, never heard of it. And so I wanted to go in the White House and be an advisor and work in government and help my country. And so I went to work at a law firm in New York where the man who wrote that speech for John Kennedy worked. His name was Ted Sorensen, in my view, the greatest presidential speechwriter ever. And I worked with him for a few years, and ultimately, I got enough courage to say, can you get me a job with somebody who can get me into the White House? And he did, and he got me a job with a man who was running for President of the United States. His name was Birch Bayh, 1976. As you all probably know, he didn't make it. In fact, 30 days after I joined his operation, he dropped out. And so, as will probably happen to you, or may have happened to you, it was a thing where I was looking at myself saying, uh-oh, nobody thought I was a great lawyer. Nobody was upset when I left the law firm. The clients were probably happy. And I went to work for somebody who thought me to be President of the United States, and it didn't work out. And then I got a call out of the blue from somebody I didn't know, and maybe you've had this before. I happened to answer it. They said, would you like to work for somebody else who's going to run for President of the United States? And I rolled my eyes. Who is it? His name is Jimmy Carter. He's a peanut farmer from Georgia. But I don't know. Anyway, eventually I took the job. I went there, and at the time, Jimmy Carter was 33 points ahead of Gerald Ford, the incumbent president. And after my work was done, Carter won by 1 point. So Carter often wonders, what was your contribution? But White House staffs, as we've seen over the last 40 years, are not filled by people on merit. They're filled by people who worked in a campaign. So I became, at 27 years old, the Deputy Domestic Policy Advisor to the President of the United States, a job for which I was completely unqualified. But Carter was unqualified as well. I thought he didn't know anything. He was governor of Georgia. He didn't know anything about Washington either. So I worked there for 4 years. I loved it. I mean, to me, it was the greatest thrill in the world. Here I'm serving my country. The thing I really wanted to do at 27, I'm running around on Air Force One, Marine One. The President of the United States is asking my opinion. I mean, what could be greater in life? But one of my responsibilities was to help fight inflation, and I managed to get it to 19%, which is very difficult to do. No one has done it since. I managed to fight mortgage rates and got them down to 22%. So on the rumor that I was going to be appointed to be the senior advisor in the second term, and exactly the same age as Ted Sorensen at 31, really become, the more important advisor to the president in the second term. On the strength of that rumor, President Carter thinks he lost the election. So I had to go out, and a life-transforming experience. I went back and practiced law, but it was very difficult. And some of you will have this experience and may have had it. One day, I've gone to Duke University, a great school. I've gone to University of Chicago Law School, a great school. I practice at a great firm. I'm an advisor to the President of the United States. And the next day, I can't get a job, unemployed. Because when we lost the election, all of a sudden, all the people said to me, "You're a bright young man, come call me when you want to work in my law firm." I called them the day after the election, and none of them called me back, because nobody wanted to hire an ex-Carter White House aide who was 31 years old and really hadn't practiced law and didn't know much about law. And so it took me many, 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 many months to convince a law firm to hire me at any position. And finally, a modest-sized law firm hired me for a very junior position. I had to start my life all over again professionally, and it was disconcerting, but in the end it was great because it was humbling, and it made me realize, what's more important in life and what things you really have to worry about and what's ephemeral and what's not ephemeral. And I did that for a number of years, and it came to the conclusion after a while that I wasn't a great lawyer, and I had to do something different. And
okay. So I just have to tell everybody that as we were walking up to the stage here, David said, "Well, you'll ask, what's the drill? You'll ask me questions,
right.
And I'll do whatever I want, right?"
That's right. Well, generally. So that's what happened. And I'm still, I'm sorry to do that. But so what happened when I started Carlyle? Well, go ahead.
Yeah.
You want to talk about Carlyle?
So let me back up a little
go
bit.
Ahead. All right.
So after this astonishing success in your role with Jimmy Carter, apparently he's forgiven you because the two of you still talk.
Right.
And so I'm curious, do the two of you ever reminisce and say, if only we had done such and such, that it would have all turned out a little bit better?
Well, everybody in life likes to blame other people. How many people like to blame themselves? So, of course, the people in the Carter White House and President Carter would say, if only, the Iranian situation hadn't happened, if only the energy crisis hadn't happened, if only certain people had been more cooperative in Congress. Of course, we also say we did a better job than the public recognized, and we did many great things, but the public hasn't recognized it yet, and maybe in history they will. So, of course, everybody who works in a White House thinks they did a great job, and one of the reasons is this. When you work in a White House, all the information comes into you. So you are the repository of all the information in the world and the United States, and when you make a decision, you have better information, theoretically, than anybody else. So that's why presidents often say, it's a communications problem I have. If only I could communicate better, because I've made the right decision. Now, the truth is, many of them have not made the right decision, but they think they have because they have the best information, they have theoretically the best advisors, but it doesn't always work out that way. In Carter's case, he had some bad luck. We had, obviously, the Iranian situation. Had that not happened, Carter might have been reelected. And we tend to judge presidential success or not by being reelected. And by not having been reelected, it transformed the image of Carter. And actually, although he had been extremely popular in the beginning of his term, became very unpopular. And back when Reagan beat him so decisively, Carter went very much down in popularity and kind of was submerged for a while, and people really didn't really want to talk about him very much. But one of the great lessons I've taken away from Carter is what he did. I went into the business world and I, did okay in it. There are people who've been far more successful. But Carter had to do something that hadn't been done before. He had to take a unsuccessful presidency in the view of many people and transform his life. What does he do? He left the presidency when he was 56 years old. What do you do for the remaining 30 plus years of your life? And our presidents now have much greater time as ex-presidents than they do as presidents. In the old days, they tended to die not too long after they were president. Now they're around for 20, 30 years afterwards. And Carter created a life for himself, which actually, I think, while it's controversial in points, he's written 28 or 29 books. He's done some incredible things at the Carter Center. And so he's a great lesson in how you can take adversity, the low point of his election, re-election defeat, and really make yourself a useful person in society, won the Nobel Peace Prize for what he's done. So I admire what he did after he left the presidency, and I know from talking to President Obama, he is focusing on what he's going to do when he's ex-president, because he will be an ex-president for probably 30 years or so as well. So anyway, I wouldn't say that we've sat down a lot and commiserated about all the things we should have done or not done. I did see President Carter not long ago, and I was making a speech in LA. He happened to be in the same place. and we talked briefly about the world. And you know, it's just hard to envision a guy as mobile as he is and as smart as he is at the age of 89. He's still going very, very strong. And you have to admire what he did after a very big defeat.
Yeah. So I had a conversation like this with David Gergen a few weeks ago, and of course David worked in the Ford White House and the Reagan White House, not the Carter White House. And his observation was that Jimmy Carter was cut out to be a saint, not a president. Does that resonate with you?
Jimmy Carter, in my view, had a high degree of moral certitude about his positions. And I think what you have to do as president, you have to be somewhat more flexible and recognize that politics is part of the game. And if you aren't willing to play politics, you aren't likely to get as many things as you want out of Congress. And you know, so I would say Jimmy Carter will probably stand out in history for the rectitude of his positions and for having avoided scandals and having done a number of things that we live with today. For example, his focus on human rights in foreign policy is something that he really started, and his focus on helping people who are underprivileged get better positions in society was something he really focused a lot on. But I don't think historians will say he was a great president because he didn't get reelected, unfortunately, from his point of view. But still, I think as you look at presidents in the United States, you have to look at what they actually did when they were there. And I think what Carter did was impressive, but he didn't get reelected, and unfortunately, that's how you often judge success.
So you are, you're extremely patriotic. You've even created a category of philanthropy called patriotic philanthropy. Do you ever think about getting back in the game in terms of public service? To say, I was 27, I didn't know what I was doing, now I'm ready, coach, put me back in the game.
Well, since I left the government, there has been no demand for me to go back. You know, I have met many people when they were president, and they never said, hey, David, why don't you come back in? You did a great job fighting inflation last time. Nobody says that. But when John Kennedy gave his speech, in those days, it was thought that to commit to public service, you had to go into government. Now the world is different. We have NGOs that are doing as many good things for society as the government can do. And I have thought that, to be realistic, my greater contribution can be in the philanthropic area. And one of the things I have tried to do is to give back to our government that way. So the phrase that you mentioned is one that I may more or less coined, called patriotic philanthropy. Now, philanthropy, I want to remind everybody, is an ancient Greek word that means loving humanity. It has nothing to do with rich people writing checks. It's just helping other people with your ideas, your time, your energy, whatever you can do. We've bastardized the word a bit, and now we kind of just say, well, if you write checks, you're a philanthropist. If you're Wendy Kopp and you create Teach for America, you're not a philanthropist. But the truth is, what Wendy Kopp has done is great for society, and other people do great things who don't write checks. In my case, I now have more money than I really deserve, or than I really need, or than my children really need, though they don't believe that necessarily. And I've decided to try in my life to give away the bulk of the money while I'm alive. And so I was one of the first 40 people that signed the Giving Pledge, and one of the other people who signed it was a graduate of Fuqua, was Melinda Gates. And she and I think we're the only two Duke people at the time who signed it. There may be some more now. And the idea was to give back to society. In my own case, I got very lucky. I started a business, it took off for a lot of luck. And now I'm now in a position to give back. And among the things I want to do is not just give to universities, which I think is very important. I think universities are one of the greatest assets of our country, is our higher education system, and it's the envy of the world, and it deserves a lot of financial support. And I believe that as well, medical research and things like that are things I'm very interested in as well. But one of the things I try to do is to give back to the country, because our country cannot afford the things that it used to be able to afford. The government doesn't have the money. So, for example, when a lot of historic documents have come along that I thought would maybe leave the country, I went and bought them. So I bought a copy of the Magna Carta, copies of the Emancipation Proclamation, copies of the Declaration of Independence, and put them on display in Washington so people could see them and make them, in effect, permanent loans to the United States. When the Washington Monument had its problems, I decided I would put up the money to help repair it, and other things in Washington, the Smithsonian, the National Archives, National Gallery of Art, the Kennedy Center. These are things where the federal government just doesn't have the money as it used to. So I try to say, if you give back to the country, you can repay the obligation we all have. I said when I bought the Magna Carta that night at Sotheby's that I wanted to use it as a down payment on my obligation to this country, to repay it for enabling me to be able to do what I did. I came from a very modest circumstances with a last name that may not have enabled me to rise up in other circumstances in other countries. So I felt very indebted to the country, and I really want to give a large part of my money away and to give my time and energy to helping the country in ways that maybe it can't do things itself today. And, for example, I take the Washington Monument as an example, not to pat myself on the back it wasn't that much money, relatively speaking. What happened was, it just occurred to me when they had the earthquake damage there, we should get it repaired quickly. I thought the U.S. government would take forever to get it done. The Congress would do some things that would take too much time. So I went to the head of the Park Service and said, I'll put up the money. How much will it take to repair it? He says, I don't know. And ultimately he came back to me and said, it's going to take $15 million. I said, okay, I'll put it up and repair it as quickly as you can. And then he came back to me and said, well, actually, some people in Congress want some credit for doing something good for a change. So they would like to put up half the money. I said, okay, then let them put up half the money. So we did. And then we erected around it we had scaffolding, and some of you may have been in Washington, seen it was beautiful, it had lights and so forth. And when the scaffolding was up, they said to me, would you like to go to the top of the Washington Monument? It's very rare to be able to go to the top of the Washington Monument on the outside. And they had an elevator on the outside of the scaffolding. So I said, okay. So I get there that day, and the Secretary of Interior, which controls the Park Service, said she wanted to come with me. Her name is Sally Jewell. She was new. I said, okay. She said, listen, I don't really want to take the elevator up. I'm a mountain climber, and I've climbed Mount Rainier 7 times. I said, well, I've flown over Mount Rainier 7 times. And I don't. She said, I know, we have to climb up. I said, well, like, is there a defibrillator somewhere? Not in good shape. But anyway, we climbed up, and then they put a little harness on me, and I get to the very top. It's 555 feet. And the reason it's that high is because they learned in ancient Egypt when they were building obelisks that if you build them more than 10 times the size of the base, it will fall over. So it's 55 feet down there and 555 feet up. I got to the very, very top, right at the point, and when nobody was looking, I took out a pen and wrote my initials there. So if any of you ever get there, you'll see my initials. And one last aside about that, all of you have probably seen the monument, and it's a great symbol of our country in many ways. It was a typical Washington project. It was conceived of not when George Washington died in 1799. He died in 1799, and he died because he made a mistake. He was 67 years old. He was riding around his plantation. It was snowing and sleeting. He came back. He had guests in his house. He always had guests because it was considered normal to come by and pay homage to George Washington. For 20 years, he and his wife never had dinner alone. That's why they were happily married, some people say. And they always had guests there. And so he had guests, he didn't know who they were. He was dripping wet, but rather than be impolite and go up and change, he sat there for 4 hours, ultimately caught pneumonia in effect, and died. And right before he died, they called the doctors in. He couldn't breathe and so forth. And what did they do? Well, they cut the veins so the blood would come out because he had bad spirits. So 1/3 of his blood went out. That was considered modern medicine in those days. Anyway, when he died, he said in his will 2 things, very interesting. 1, don't bury me for 2 days. Well, why would that be? Well, because in those days, the medical treatment was so bad that people often were buried alive. And so he didn't want to be buried alive. So he said, don't bury me for 2 days to make sure I'm dead. In fact, very often the coffins in those days had little bells in them to make sure that, if somebody woke up, you could ring the bell and say, get me out of here. He also said he was the only founding father that freed his slaves. The only founding father who freed his slaves. But he did a little differently. He said, my slaves are all freed upon the death of my wife. Now, how would you like to be Martha Washington knowing that? So anyway, she freed him quickly. But he died in 1799. He wasn't so popular in those days, actually, in many all circles. So it wasn't until 1832 that they decided to build the Washington Monument, 100 years after he was born. And it didn't finish the typical Washington project. They started in 1832. They ran out of money, a whole bunch of other things. They didn't finish to 1880. It took 50 years to get it done. So, hopefully things are a little bit better in Washington, but not much.
Okay. So let's see if I can pick a thread here.
All right.
So he's a funny guy, right? I mean, David is unbelievably funny. So two questions
Right.
about that. One, where does your sense of humor come from? How did you develop your humor skills? And the second thing is, because humor is something where there's a fair amount of heterogeneity in terms of what people think is funny,
Right.
has it ever gotten you in trouble?
Almost all the time. I'll give you one that got me in trouble recently. I was interviewing Hillary Clinton, and she had come to a Carlyle event, and I had interviewed there, and it went very well, and she thought I did a reasonably good job of interviewing her, not unlike the good job you're doing interviewing me. And very, very skilled, and she thought I did a good job, and so there was a charitable event in New York that they were looking for somebody to interview Hillary. This was a couple months ago, I think. And so they asked me if I would do it again, and I said, okay. I was involved with the charity. And so we did it at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I don't know if you've been there in New York. It's a gigantic place. And for some reason, they had it in a place with a lot of big statues. So I'm sitting here, she's sitting there, and right in front of us is a gigantic statue of Pericles, about 20 feet, completely naked. Now, we were facing the rear of him, and he's holding somebody's head. And so I'm sitting here, and she's sitting there, and I just didn't know, it was an unusual setting. We're sitting in front of here, but it's on TV, so we're not blocked from people. So I just said to her, well, have you ever been in a setting quite like this and done an interview in something in front of like this? And she said, no, it's quite impressive. And I said, well, think how much more impressive it would be if he turned around. So I quickly realized I probably shouldn't have said that. So. What I find, look, you either have a pretty good sense of humor or you don't. In my case, I guess I see the absurdity of life, maybe to some extent. And of course, humor is a defense mechanism. It's designed to deflect maybe more serious discussions and more serious things. And so maybe in life, because I came from modest circumstances and maybe was an underdog all the time, I maybe used humor as a defense mechanism. But I have found in recent years that when I would give a speech and I would use a lot of humor, people would come up to me and say they remember the humor, they remember the jokes. Then I began to realize, well, what about the substance of what I was saying? And, oh yeah, that was okay too. So I began to actually cut down the humor a little bit because I realized you could do a lot of humor and people may remember that, but sometimes you want to get them to remember the main message, which is a much more serious message. But I also found that when you give humor and you're willing to be funny and make fun about yourself, and that's one of the things I should mention, I'd say there are different types of humor. And maybe because I admired John Kennedy a lot, I try to find his humor the best kind, which is self-deprecating humor. I never try to make fun of somebody else. I just think that's not a good thing. I know people that try to do that. My humor generally tends to be self-deprecating, and I think that generally works pretty well, because if you're a wealthy business person and you make a speech, somebody will think you're a stuffed shirt or you're arrogant and so forth. And by using humor, I think you can show, you are a common person, relatively speaking. You can see the absurdity of life, and you can make fun of yourself. And by making fun of yourself, people are more willing to listen to you because they think you're not an arrogant idiot, which is what they might otherwise think.
Okay, so let's go to age 37, and that was your age when you co-founded Carlyle, and your age at that time is fairly close to the average age of an entrepreneur. There's a myth that that an entrepreneur is Bill Gates or Mark Zuckerberg. Their kids, the average age is 40. But I'm curious, given your experience as a lawyer and working at the White House, and what prepared you for the world of private equity? What led you to say, I'm going to make now a career bet in this area?
Well, a couple things happened. One, in the years when I should have learned how to be a good lawyer, and I did reasonably well in law school. I wasn't going to be Oliver Wendell Holmes or Benjamin Cardozo or Louis Brandeis, but I was a reasonably
He was on the law review, so.
Okay, but I was okay, but I wasn't a genius. But clearly, if you take reasonable skills and you work hard, you can make yourself into a reasonably decent lawyer. But the years when I should have been learning those skills, I was at the White House getting inflation up to 19%. So when I went back to practice law...
So you realized you had business skills.
Well, right. I didn't know what skills I had. I wasn't sure I had any skills, but The years when I should have learned how to be a serious lawyer when you're a young professional, I absented myself. So when I went back to practice law, I didn't really have the skills to be a lawyer. And so I realized that the legal world had become a business. And really was down to you selling clients on your firm. And so I really made myself into a bit of a salesman selling my firm and getting other people to do the work. I really didn't do the work, and I was trying to bring in the business a bit. And so also, a couple things happened. To me, I realized if you don't love what you're doing, you cannot be great at it. Nobody ever won a Nobel Prize working 9 to 5, 5 days a week on something you didn't like. You have to, if you're going to make a success of yourself, you have to love what you're doing. And I tell students all the time when I meet with them and tell my own children, experiment when you're in your 20s, try many different things. Hopefully something will come to you that you love and it's not work. And I just, didn't really love practicing law. I didn't like what lawyers do. I didn't see it was really changing the world. I didn't think I was really, making a mark on the world. And so I took a gamble, and I was propelled by an article I read that said, on average, people who start companies start in between the ages of 28 and 37. There's always a Mark Zuckerberg or Bill Gates who are different, but on average, the first entrepreneurial activity of somebody is between 28 and 37. And not unlike a woman's biological time clock, after 37, the chances of certain things happening are lower. So I read that when I was 37. And I said, uh-oh. So I realized I didn't have the skills of an investment professional, but I went out and recruited a few people who knew more about finance than I did. And I basically decided to do this in Washington, remembering a sentence by Edward Dirksen. He was the Senate Minority Leader in the 1960s. And he famously said, when you're getting kicked out of town, get out in front and pretend you're leading a parade. Now, what does that mean? Take advantage of the situation you find yourself in. So I'm in Washington, D.C. Everybody who's serious about investing is in New York in private equity. So I said, we're going to focus on companies more heavily affected by the federal government than people elsewhere do. And we understand the federal government more because we're in Washington. Now, that wasn't necessarily the case, but it sounded good. And then I recruited 3 people who knew what they were doing a little bit. They didn't have buyouts experience. And I took 6 months to raise the first $5 million. And then the company took off a bit. And we took off for 4 reasons. I'll be very brief on what they are. One, we had good chemistry between the founders. So if you can get people who work together, that's good. And my founders and co-founders and I have been together for 27 years now. That's unusual, but that worked. We also had, therefore, division of labor. We each focused on what we knew best and could do the best and made ourselves indispensable in that area. We were lucky and good in what we did. Our main thing is investing money. So we've averaged 30% a year for 27 years. That's considered good in the investment world, 30% gross, 24% net. But we did 2 things that changed the face of the private equity world. And whenever you are trying to build a business, if you only ape what somebody else did, or you only copy somebody else, you won't likely be that wonderful. And so we just came up with something that was different, and it changed the private equity world. When KKR did the famous RJR deal in 1989, they only had 7 people in the firm. And that was because the rules in those days said if you're in private equity or buyouts, you could have one fund at a time, one buyout fund, and you had to spend 100% of your time on that. And therefore, you couldn't build more businesses because you had to spend 100% of your time on that, managing that one fund. I decided to ignore that and to do something that I would say it's easier to ask for forgiveness than permission. I didn't want to go to my investors and say, would you mind, we have one fund, we want to have more funds to build a big business. I didn't do that. I just assumed that I would say I was sorry later, and I just went out and built a business that was designed to institutionalize private equity. It was to say, we had a buyout fund, we're going to have a venture fund, a growth capital fund, a real estate fund, and build a family of funds, not unlike what Fidelity had done in Boston in the mutual fund area. I was going to do the same thing in private equity. And that was our clever idea, to institutionalize the business, have many different funds, and therefore be able to, in effect, amortize the cost of building this business. And then I decided, secondly, to globalize it, to go around the world, and that had not been done before, which is to say, have an American flag on a European buyout fund, an Asian fund, a Japan fund, and that's how we built the business. And obviously the track record helped. So we did many things, and we changed the face of the private equity world. But today, my biggest concern is that what I did to the firms in New York was to disrupt them. They had a model of one fund at a time. They just did buyouts. I came along with many different products and created a family of funds, and I disrupted the business model of people in New York. Now my fear is that somebody's going to come along, maybe one of you, and disrupt my business model. So you always have to be worried when you're at the top whether somebody is going to come along with a better business model and disrupt you, and it's inevitably happens to big companies. And so I spend most of my time worrying about how we can change our business model to adapt to the future.
So are you confident that you're sufficiently differentiated within the existing private equity landscape, that the real threat is from the new entrants as opposed to the incumbents?
Right. It's a complicated question because today, whenever you're at the top of the world in any given area, business schools or law schools, universities, any kind of business endeavor, you kind of say, well, now you finally clawed your way to the top, and now you're part of the elite, and as you're part of the elite, why don't we just kind of work together and we all kind of say we're doing the same things together, and you can convince people that if you really want to be at the top, invest with Carlyle because we're like Blackstone, we're like KKR, we all do very good things, and we're stable, we're going to be around forever, and so forth. But the downside to that is that you can become a commodity. And if people think there's no difference between you and KKR and Blackstone, and you're commoditized, in the end, somebody will come along and say, well, I'm different. These guys at the top are just a commodity. I have a better product. So, you go back and forth between whether you really want to say we're part of the elite and we're really great and we're like the other guys, or we're really different than the other guys. So, of course, we'd like to say we are great and we're different from the other guys. And we're different, we would say, because we have a different culture. We are more global. We're more focused on certain kinds of things. But the most important thing in our firm is the culture. In any organization, what will kill a firm or will make it survive is the culture. And if the culture is good, where you're sharing the wealth, you put the investors first, you really have a focus on what is the right thing to do, you can build a good business. The trick is to make it get to the next generation. A lot of great entrepreneurs build great companies, and then when they leave, the companies fall apart. A really great company is one where the entrepreneur knows when to step back, bring in very good people, and they can keep the same culture and enhance it and get it to the next generation. It's unclear yet whether the great private equity firms that have built can really go to a second or a third generation because these are relatively new phenomenon.
As you think about that, that task of building a great and sustained culture, is that something that the co-founders split up and said, David, you do it, or did you have to provide mutual reinforcement?
Well, the way we worked was that we had really three of us were really running the firm for 25 years. We've now brought in a lot of other people to help us and so forth. And, one person oversaw the investments. Bill Conway was a great investor. One person did a lot of the administrative and operational things, Dan Daniello, and I focused on adding my own value. I wasn't an investor, so in any organization, I always tell students, find something that you can do that makes yourself indispensable. You want people to come to you and say, you're the expert in this, can you help me? And when people come to you and say in an organization, can you do this for me, can you do that? Eventually they'll say, well, he or she did that well, I'll try another thing and ask them to do something else. And your power base expands and your opportunities to do more expands. But learn one thing well and make it your own. And I decided to make myself into the fundraiser, the guy who would raise the money. And this was not naturally something I thought I would do, because I'd always seen fundraisers as being, the kind of backslapping, beer drinking, golf playing, suspender wearing kind of guys, and I don't do any of those things. So I didn't think it was natural for me, but I decided that I had to do something to make myself indispensable or valuable to the firm, and I said I would go out and raise the money. And so I did that, and as I now think about it, I'm not sure if they do this at Fuqua or other business schools, but most of life actually is about selling. And when you think about it, life is really about persuading other people to do what you want. Because you are trying to persuade your spouse, your business partner, your children, your parents, anybody that you have a good idea, you have a good product, you have a good service. You're trying to persuade other people. Salesmanship is really what life is about when you think about it. And yet it's a skill that isn't taught all that much, and probably there's no great courses, maybe you have one, many schools don't, on fundraising. People don't really say that they want to learn the skill or teach the skill of fundraising, even though you will find, if you don't already know, you're going to spend most of your life trying to sell something or fundraise. And very few people say, I want my little boy Johnny to be a fundraiser when he grows up. But the truth is, how many people here have asked other people for money in the last year or so? Anybody ever done that? Anybody here asked people for money for philanthropic, political, or business things? How many people have done that? All right, how many people have been asked? Okay. Okay.
You all should have your hands up.
Right, right.
Oh my goodness.
So, you know, very often people who are embarrassed about it, they will preface it by saying, I'm sorry to ask you for money. Well, if you're sorry to ask, why are you doing it? You shouldn't be sorry. If you're asking for a good cause or a good project or something, you should be proud of doing it. So I made myself into a bit of the fundraising and the relationship kinds of things and built, you know, a career of kind of being the face of the firm. And I did a lot of travel. I would travel 40 or 50 countries a year asking for money and trying to develop the brand of the firm, and that's kind of what I did. And the culture of the firm evolved over a period of time. The culture was put the investors first and what we call one Carlyle. Everybody works together. So if you're in Sydney or in Stockholm, you have to really be responsive to other people in the firm. If you're not going to be there very long. And that kind of cooperative culture is what I think has helped us as much as our track record.
Do you think that the cooperative culture sets you apart relative to the New York firms?
Well, that's a loaded question because if I answer yes, it will say something negative about the other firms, and if I answer no, I won't be honest, so I have to think about that. Look, people who come out of investment banking backgrounds often have a more, I would say, cutthroat kind of approach, and there's no doubt that people in Wall Street are, can be very bottom line oriented. None of my founders and I came out of Wall Street, and therefore our culture was a little bit different. But the firms in New York that have done well, they all have different cultures. I don't want to say ours is better; it's just different in some respects. But they all have done quite well in many respects. And now, what's happened to private equity? It's evolved dramatically. We're in what I call private equity 4.0 now because the industry has changed dramatically, and it's probably changed in the more in the last 4 years or 5 years than it did over the previous 40 years or so. But among the major changes is it's bifurcated. There are now 5,000 private equity firms in the world, but there are about 4,000 of them that are relatively small, or 4,500 or maybe more than that. And then there are only about 7 that are global, that are truly offering many different products in many different areas around the world. There are 7 of us. It's Carlyle, Blackstone, TPG, KKR, Apollo, Bain, and Oaktree. All have roughly $75 billion or more under management and are trying to offer investment funds around the world. And some of them, or 5 of those 7, are publicly traded now. And I suspect in a couple years, there will probably be 2 or 3 of them that are so well known that they're as well known to the public as, let's say, Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley or JP Morgan. And they all are doing exactly the same thing now. All 7 of us are doing this. We are expanding the product base. We're trying to go get more individual investors and really reaching out to accredited investors and even non-accredited investors. And we are working on special relationships with sovereign wealth funds and globalizing the business such that our brand is well known. And ultimately, I suspect at some point you'll see a global alternative or a global private equity firm having a Super Bowl ad because we're appealing to people, who are the general public. So the business has changed. And interestingly, although the United States is today only 20% of the world's GDP, in 1960, we were 47% of the world's GDP. We're now only 20%. We are 100% of the global private equity firms. That probably won't continue forever. At some point, somebody will come along in Brazil or China or the Middle East and build a global private equity firm, but it won't be in any short time period because it takes a long time to raise this money. We manage now, let's say roughly close to $200 billion, and it takes a long time to raise that, so I don't think anybody in China can overnight do it, but at some point, it will change. If you take a look at the leading private equity firms in 1980 or 95 or 90 or 95, they're different than the leading ones today because some have just fallen by the wayside and some have moved up. And I suspect in 10 years from today, they'll be different than the 7 I mentioned. But for the next 5 years, those 7 will probably still be dominant because it takes too long for anybody else to get as big as they are.
As you look at the reasons behind the success you've had personally, can you talk about the role of your work ethic, which is prodigious, and the follow-up to that is, do you ever sleep?
Well, I used to say sleep is overrated, but as I've gotten older, I'm not sure that's true. Listen, I guess, I maybe felt as a young person I wasn't as gifted intellectually as people who I was competing with in grade school or high school or college, and therefore I thought the only way to really keep up with them was to work hard. And so maybe I worked hard because the only way I thought I could compete. I did find that also that my social skills were very limited. So if I was in the library all the time, I didn't have to show how limited my social skills were. And my athletic skills were even more limited. I was the only person in Duke's history who got cut from an intramural basketball team when there were only 4 other people on the team. So so I didn't have athletic skills, I didn't have social skills, so I guess as a way to bury myself in one thing that I was good at, maybe some kind of intellectual kinds of things, and I just had to catch up to others who were smarter than me. So maybe I developed a work habit, and it maybe been exacerbated or worsened, frankly, by when I worked in the White House, I worked around the clock, and there was an article written in Newsweek about me saying I was a White House workaholic, and I ate all my food out of the machines and so forth. And I may have tried to live up to that image by working harder than maybe I should have. I'm not sure, but I don't really regard what I have done over my career as work so much, because my view is if you love what you're doing, it's not work. So I love what I'm doing. Today, I obviously don't need to work, but I'm doing what I'm doing at a very long hourly pace because I love what I'm doing. You know, when you build a firm from scratch to something that's large, you take pride in it and you want to see it succeed, and so I love what I'm doing. Today, I divide my life largely between being the co-CEO of the company, which is now publicly traded, and my philanthropic activities, and I go back and forth, and every day I'm doing some of both, and I love what I'm doing. My biggest problem is I am 64 years old. Now, when you turn 50, you can pretend you've lived half your life, and most people, when they get to their 50th birthday, they have big celebrations or so forth, and when I turned 50, I was very happy. I thought I reached 50, my firm is okay, my family's in good shape, and I'll live another 50. Probably not, but maybe you can pretend it. When you turn to 60, you realize you probably live more than you're going to live, realistically. And I notice when I turn 60, people come to me all the time and say, well, David, you look good today. Well, how do you think I was supposed to look? Well, no, you really look good today. Well, what do you think I was supposed to look like? And I also notice, I'm the chairman of the Kennedy Center. It's the Performing Arts Center. And they have these young women graduating from college, about 23, 24. They escort me around to various events. And they'll say, well, Mr. Rubenstein, there are 7 steps here. Can you walk up them or should we take the elevator? So, it drives home to me that I'm in my 60s. And, I recruited Lou Gerstner to my firm after he was the CEO of IBM for about 12 years. And he joined my firm when he was 60. He retired when he was 60. I'm 64. I love what I'm doing, but I realize that you can't do it forever, and you can't do it at the pace you want. So I don't know when my mind or when my body will give out. And so we have brought a lot of people into the firm who could run the firm maybe better than the people running it today. And so I'm racing through life now. I'm writing a book about my life, and the working title is Striving for the Finish Line or something like that, because I feel like I'm racing to get to the finish line before too long, because I know I'm not going to be able to do this another 25 years or so, and I want to get so many things done in my life. So I'm very happy with where I am. I don't regard what I'm doing as work, and I don't regret the time that I put into my career, because it's made me very, very happy. And when you get to be wealthy in life, none of you who are not wealthy will agree with this, when you get to be wealthy in life, it's not necessarily the case that money equals happiness. When Thomas Jefferson wrote that we should pursue happiness, or what are the goals of the United States, pursue happiness, he never defined what happiness was all about. So people often say, well, happiness is having $1 billion or $2 billion or $10 billion. Most of the billionaires I know are tortured and not that happy, honestly. Now, they may not give comfort to you who want to be billionaires that you shouldn't aspire to it, but the truth is, having money does not equal success and happiness. I am very happy, probably though happiest when I'm giving away the money. Because I have found that making money is nice and so forth, but as I said in an article recently, my mother, and I'm the only child, so naturally if you're the only child and your mother's Jewish, she's going to take great pride in you, and she's nothing you can do wrong, okay? So, but she never actually called me up and said, David, I'm proud of you building the largest private equity firm in the world, or one of the best private equity firms. She never said that. But she started calling me saying, David, I'm really proud of you for giving away this money. I'm really proud of you for doing that, for helping that cause. So it just hit home to me that you really can enjoy life even more when you're giving away the money or doing something to help other people. And so that part of my life has made it much more enriching, and therefore, unlike a lot of rich people who don't give away as much money as I think they should, I feel very happy to do it. As I mentioned, I signed the Giving Pledge, and the Giving Pledge is okay. It has its faults in the sense that I think we should now make it available really to people with different net worths, but the Giving Pledge really only says you're supposed to give away half your money in your lifetime or upon your death. Now, of course, if you give away no money during your lifetime and then you die and you're supposed to give away half and then your will is read and you don't have to give it away, we don't disinter you out and take you out of the Giving Pledge. So I hope more people will actually start giving away the money while they're alive, and I'm trying to give away the bulk of mine while I'm alive.
Yeah. So it's very important for Fuqua to develop a culture of philanthropy. And I wonder if you can just talk to the people here about what was it that caused you to start thinking about the role of philanthropy in your life, and how can we get everyone in our community to really have that?
Well, it's an interesting phenomenon in the sense that, some families have philanthropic traditions, and, even if they're not wealthy, their family may have given a lot of time and energy and ideas and so forth, or volunteerism and so forth, and we have a great tradition of that in the United States. But I basically was tunnel vision on making the money. And it's a very strange phenomenon. You're racing and racing and racing to make the money. All of a sudden you hit the line, you say, wait a second, I'm going to give away this stuff that I killed myself to make. And it's strange where you work so hard to make this money and it's in your bank account, you're very happy it's there, and then you start saying, I'm going to give it away quicker than I made it. But what happened was, it wasn't anything that was completely unique to me. Forbes magazine eventually outed me, and they've outed other people. They kind of calculate what your net worth is, and whether those are accurate or not, they're probably within reason, somewhat accurate. And so I realized that I had this enormous amount of money, and I didn't really think that if I was buried with it, like the ancient pharaohs, that I would necessarily need it in the afterlife. And I didn't necessarily think that dying and becoming the richest person in the cemetery and having my executor give away the money would necessarily make me happier. So I began to say, okay, who was helpful to me in my life and my family's life, and who are things, or what are things that I could do to make the world a modestly better place? Because my view is, none of us really know the secrets of the universe. Nobody really knows why we're here. Nobody really knows whether there's life in other planets. Nobody really knows many things about the universe, Earth, and so forth. We all may have religious beliefs, but nobody knows for certain why we're here. But it's my general view that most people come to the feeling that there is some good thing about trying to make the world a slightly better place and to help other people. And when you're involved with philanthropy, you are helping other people. Very few people on their deathbed say, I'm glad I have as much money as I have in my bank account, and I'm glad I didn't spend time helping other people. That rarely happens. Usually, people say, I am glad that I gave away money here, I'm glad I helped that cause, I'm glad I worked at that food bank, and very rarely do you see somebody say, boy, I'm upset with myself for giving away money. I'm upset with myself for helping people. That rarely happens. And my general theory as well is it's a little selfishness in this. When you give away money, you help other people, you feel better about yourself. And when you feel better about yourself, you're likely to live longer. Grumpy people don't live as long. Happy people live longer. And so for a lot of selfish reasons, maybe I'm giving away the money, maybe I think I'll get to heaven more quickly, I can't prove it, but I don't know. But I enjoy it, and I enjoy the intellectual challenge of thinking of something that hasn't been done before. In my own philanthropy, I don't have the money that Bill and Melinda Gates has, and I'm never going to have that. I have a lot of money by any normal human standards, but not by their standards, so I don't have their burden. And think about it in your case, and I've often wondered, and you all laugh when I say this, what would you do if tomorrow you had $100 billion? All right, of course, you'll go buy a yacht, you'll buy a plane, you'll buy a couple houses, then you've got $99.9 billion left. What are you going to do with $100 billion? That's the problem that Bill Gates and Melinda Gates have found themselves with. And what problems can you really solve, and what can you do with that kind of money? Well, it's hard to know. They've picked K-12 education in the United States and health in Africa as two of their major causes, and they're great causes. Whether they have enough money and time to do that, I don't know. I've tried to find things that are, less maybe overarching than that, and things where I can start something and get it off the ground and make it happen, or I can finish something that was going to get done but was floundering a bit, or I can complete something myself by just getting it done and thinking of something. So very often I would say, okay, what can I do to help in, let's say, a historic area? So I will say, I want to restore Monticello, or I want to restore some other things that I'll announce shortly that I'm doing in the historic area. Or certain healthcare areas, I say, okay, I think pancreatic cancer is a terrible disease. We don't know enough about it. 5% survival rate. I'll put up money to create a center at Sloan Kettering for that. And you try different things in philanthropy. You don't know what's going to work. And in the business world, we have a metric. It's called a profit and loss statement. And if you're good in business, you'll have a lot of profits, you'll make a lot of money. We don't have an equivalent metric in philanthropy. We don't know whether these things we're doing are really work. So you experiment. Some things seem to work, some things don't. We don't really know. I am not the kind of philanthropist who sits on top of the person and every hour on the hour wants a report from them of what they're doing with my money. I generally, try to, give an overview of what I'm looking at and give some rough judgment. But I try to find some things that are working and then give them more money, and things that aren't working, you give them less money. But none of the things I've given money to do I regret. I wish some would have been more successful than others, but generally I'm very happy with what I've done, and I just wish I had more time to do it and more time to focus on it.
Thank you. So I think we have some time for a few questions from the audience. Yes. Here's a microphone for you.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for coming. So you mentioned some values that you really like humor or innovation and how you value culture. Do you have a specific philosophy on leadership, or what other values do you look for most in a leader?
Leadership is a very elusive thing. I'd like to say sometimes that the most elusive thing in life is personal happiness. As all of you will find in the course of your life, if you haven't already, they're very difficult to be truly happy. Those who are truly happy are blessed. Those who are not have to struggle with various things in their life. Leadership is also something that's very elusive. And people have debated for many years, can you teach leadership? Or can you just, are leaders born? And I don't think there's a one right answer or not. I think you can learn a lot from what other people have done. What I try to say about leadership is that you lead people in really three ways. And each of them has its own skill set. One is you lead by the way you communicate with people. And you can lead, by writing well. Leadership, very often, people who write well and have written books or articles lead other people because they have great ideas and they communicate them well in the written word. Another way is communicating by speaking. A lot of great leaders and a lot of people who have done terrible things but were leaders had great communication skills. And I tell students all the time, if you want to be a leader, learn how to write well, not just Twitter language, but learn how to write to convey meaningful things in a way that will persuade other people, and learn also how to talk in a meaningful way that will persuade other people. But the third way of leading is the much more valuable one, and that is leading by example. So back to George Washington. George Washington was a wealthy man, one of the wealthiest men in the United States. And when Valley Forge occurred in 1777 and 1778, in those days they didn't fight wars in the wintertime, they just kind of set out to wait till the spring to come. And so in Valley Forge, the troops are sitting there, they have no shoes, barely have any food, clothes are very limited, very little sleeping quarters. George Washington could have stayed somewhere else, but he stayed with his troops to show them that he was part of them, and he led by example. And when you lead by example, because what you do means more than sometimes what you say, I think that is the best example of leadership. So in my firm, for example, if I say to people, you shouldn't do X or shouldn't do Y, but I'm caught doing it, it doesn't work. You have to follow, you have to lead by your own example. And I think leadership is something that you can gain insights from watching great leaders, and Mike Krzyzewski is a great leader, let's say in basketball and other areas, and I know he's involved with Fuqua. He's done a great job in leadership, and you can learn a lot from him and from other business leaders, but in the end, you have to find out what makes it work for you. Everybody has to come up with their own leadership skills. You can't only follow somebody else. You have to come up with something that works for you, and it's part of your personality. So, whether I've been a good leader or not, others can judge, but I think that the skills that I think are important are the ones I mentioned, and I think leadership is something that can't be completely taught, but you can learn a lot about leadership by watching others, but in the end, you have to do it yourself.
Oh, over here, okay.
Sir, pleasure to meet you. You referenced JFK several times. About once a quarter, I go back and watch the Rice University speech. We choose to go to the moon not because it is easy, but because I'm sorry?
Go ahead.
So the Rice University speech about we choose to go to the moon.
Yes.
Do you see that sort of vigor and fervor today? And if so, in what areas, what parts of the country?
In terms of the space program, or in terms of...
Not specifically the space program, but that sort of
okay.
just effort.
Okay. President Kennedy's speech was one that, if you go back and read, he actually wasn't sure that they could get there. It was seen very ambitious. He decided, I'm going to ignore my staff, and I'm going to go ahead and say this. And, you know, of course, he wouldn't have been president, even had he lived, probably by the time that his goal had been set. But, you know, we got there, and frequently that's now become a trite way of saying we should, you know, show leadership. We need to kind of have an effort to get to the moon, and very often people who propose certain programs say this is like Kennedy's going to the moon. I think very often today politicians are unwilling to take that kind of risk and set those kind of goals because some of them are seen as unrealistic. The politics in Washington are much worse than they used to be. We may not have as much courage in some of our leaders as we did. I think Kennedy's example was a good one, and because we actually got there, it turned out to be something that people keep citing. Interestingly, when they did get to the moon, the computer power they have is less than the computer power that you have on your smartphone. You have more computer power in your smartphone than they had on all of those moon launches and vehicles that land on the moon. So it's hard to believe. But Kennedy was very courageous in doing that. They did debate it for sure. Kennedy is a person who I have admired because I grew up during the period of time, and obviously we now know more about his life than we did before. But I do think he had a sense of what leadership was about and setting goals and learning how to communicate very well. And when he gave his great inaugural speech, that was actually the best speech he ever gave. He was actually, before that, a terrible speaker. He tended to look down all the time. He was seen as very much of a monotone, and he spent many years with speech coaches practicing how to be a better speaker. And so he actually worked at giving that speech and worked at many other speeches, and he really practiced the art of leadership and how to look like a leader, how to talk like a leader, and it wasn't something that came naturally to him.
Hi, David. I'm a first-year MBA student, and in school we've been talking a lot about social impact investing, and I wanted to see if you had seen that that's gaining traction in the private equity space, and if so, is it, you know, kind of disrupting the traditional definition of success of ROI or IRR?
The large private equity firms are basically driven to get the highest rate of return they can legally with doing the least amount of damage they can. You know, so today, in the old days of private equity, you wanted the highest rate of return if your jobs were shipped offshore, if you had to close facilities, you did some environmentally destructive things, nobody paid attention. People just said, what's your rate of return? Today, investors are caring more about certain things. So if you have a reputation for doing the kind of things that are seen as antithetical to society's overall ambitions, it might be harmful to you. But generally, investors are still interested in good rates of return. And social impact investing is a kind of a homogenized form of investing where your rate of return is going to be much lower because you're doing something that's socially good, is the theory. And my observation is that people will give lip service to wanting to have social impact investing, but they won't put up as much money as you might really think. So it's very difficult to raise that kind of money. And for the time being, I suspect it'll be limited to modest-sized funds that aren't going to really dramatically change the world. And so I think it's a good idea in concept, but I don't see it really transforming the private equity world because I think most people who give you money have fiduciary responsibilities, and they are to get the highest rate of return they can. And very few fiduciaries have the authority to get a lower rate of return and get some good social product out of it. So I'm skeptical that it will sweep the world, though I think it'd be a good thing for people to do more of it, but I don't think it will be as large a thing as some people think it will be.
You speak with the CEOs or founders of investment firms. For example, Bridgewater, Ray Dalio. They often mention that culture is an important distinguishing factor between their firms and other firms. And you said the same thing, that culture is an important differentiator. So I'd like to know, for Carlyle specifically, I know you mentioned that when we work as a firm, across different offices, we work as one firm. But I'd like to know just 2 or 3 specific things culturally, what has been there at Carlyle for the last 25 years, and especially how do you institutionalize that? Is it recruiting? Is it the way you work? Is it incentives that you create? What are 2 or 3 cultural things that you think truly are unique to Carlyle?
Okay. Well, obviously, it's very easy to have a common culture if you have one office. And it's very easy to have common culture. You have one business you're in. If you have 34 offices around the world, thousands of employees, and different business lines you're in, it's harder. And so, how do you communicate culture? How do you indoctrinate people in culture without making them, just drinking Kool-Aid and not really believing or understanding what they're doing? We do nothing that is so brilliant or so unique. We have education seminars for people. We have senior leadership conferences, junior leadership conferences, meetings where we can try to convey to people what the culture of the firm is all about. But we also try to spend as much time as we can getting people from one office to know people from another office and to have people really learn more what the firm is doing. But in the end, some people will follow the common culture, and some people will say, I just don't like it, or I don't believe it, I'm going to leave or something. It's not easy, and the larger the organization you have, the harder it is to have a common culture. And so that's why very often cultures don't survive that long, because the organizations become that big, they're too big, or because the generation that didn't found the firm is gone and the next generation might have a different culture. It's not easy. I would say we've done a reasonably good job of it, not a perfect job. I can see many ways we could do a better job, but I do think that trying to make people feel they're part of one firm and part of doing something useful. And then let me describe that. If you work for Teach for America, for example, it's not that difficult to think you're helping the world, or at least the United States, because you're doing something that's thought to be, socially rewarding and so forth, and helping people get better education. When you're in the world of making money, it can get caught up in just measuring how much money you make, and you can very often find that people will not be as focused on whether they're really making the world a better place and so forth. And I think what is important is to try to make sure that in money-making operations like ours, we try to say to people, look, what you're doing is important for the world, because what you're doing is you're making companies better. By making companies better, you're making sure people are going to be employed, and we're going to have more people employed. They're going to have healthy families. They're going to have money to support their families. We also have investors who are largely pension funds, and to having success for the pension funds is probably good for the school teachers, the firemen, the college endowments, and so forth. So what we're doing is not something that is seen, in my view, as anti-helpful to society. We are helping society by making companies better, by making economies better, by making it possible for families to have the kind of wealth and be able to get their children educated. So I try very hard to explain to people why in our firm what we do is actually a socially productive thing, and even though we're not Teach for America, we're doing something useful. And I think that's a very important thing that people have to remember when they're in the money-making business, that it's not just how much money you make, but it's what you're doing with the money and what other people who benefit from what you're doing will do with the money. And if it's pension funds, what they're going to do with it's presumably useful, and employing people and so forth. There is a school of thought, for example, that says that all of the philanthropy that Bill Gates and everybody else is doing is really wasted. This school of thought, Scott McNeely, who used to run Sun, is a proponent of this. It says you should take your money and just create more jobs. Don't give away money. The best thing you can do is just create jobs. More jobs you create, better society will be, and so forth. It's a school of thought. I don't particularly subscribe to it, but there's no doubt that there's a strand in there of thinking that that by creating jobs and by doing something good in the for-profit world, you are helping society. And I try very hard to convince people in my firm that they shouldn't feel that they're not helping society by what we're doing.
One last question.
Thank you for being here. I'm a third-year alumni of Fuqua and back to the reunion weekend. And one of the things in my career that I'm thinking about is my impossible. I heard Nelson Mandela say once that it always seems impossible until it's done. So I would like to know what it was or what is your impossible?
What it is that would...
What's his impossible?
Yes.
That
What did he feel like was impossible, and once it was done?
Well, and that I did do, or that I...
that you made possible.
Well, if you had known me when I was at Duke, you would have said the idea that this guy would be a capitalist, successful, and look, nobody would have thought 25 years ago that I would become a reasonably well-known philanthropist or build a major company. And, it's strange. I was at a Duke event recently, and a man came up to me, and he said, do you know me? My name is Robert Feldman. I said, I remember you. He was the student body president at Duke when I was here. And he was the big man on campus, that's president of student government. And, you know, he didn't know me then because I was very low on the totem pole. And, you know, it's a strange thing in life how, you know, you can't predict who's going to get successful by traditional measures of success and who is not going to be as successful. He's actually had a good career as a law professor, but nobody would have predicted that I did what I did, and nobody may predict what some of you may achieve. Some of you are going to become billionaires. Some of you are going to have struggles in your life. Some of you may have already made more money than you ever thought. Some of you had struggles in your personal or professional lives. You just can't predict. One of the things that's sad to me now is, as I'm 64, I read the obituaries more than I used to. I never understood when my parents used to read the obituaries when I was a kid. Now I read the obituaries first to see if any of my friends died and make sure that I'm not in there. And when you see somebody that is the same age as you who went to college with you dying, you kind of say, why am I so lucky to have survived? And therefore, it kind of propels me to do even more than I've done before, because I realize we're all, you know, living borrowed time to some extent. And so I try very hard to look for things that I can achieve in the remaining years of my life. I'm not trying to tilt to windmills. I don't really want to try to do things at this age that aren't really going to be completed while I'm around. I want to try to see this to come to fruition while I'm around. So anyway, I won't say that I've done anything that's impossible, but probably my classmates would say that what I achieved was impossible given the person that they once knew. So let me just conclude by saying that I think your dean has done a spectacular job as the dean and has really helped Fuqua become an even better school than it was. And let me give you my theory about giving back to one's university and one's school. When I went to Duke, it was a reasonably good school. It was then called Harvard of the South. Stanford was then Harvard of the West. The implication was it was a good school, but really segregated a bit into the South and wasn't a great national university. And when I got into Duke, I got in, I was lucky, I couldn't afford a typewriter. I wrote it out in handwriting. My handwriting was very bad, and probably that's why I got in, because they couldn't read my essays very well. So I got in, but at the time, probably, 5,000 people applied to Duke that year. This year, I think about 34,000 have applied to Duke. And I've told the Board of Trustees at Duke that not a single person on this Board of Trustees could get into Duke today. And that's not exaggeration, because the student body is much better than it used to be. And that has made everybody on the Board of Trustees, and particularly me, and people who graduate from Duke at my time, look smarter than they are. And this is what I mean. When a university goes up this way, people will say, well, this is a great university, and in effect, your degree has been inflated in value. If a university goes down this way, even if you're very smart, people will think you're less smart than you were because the university's gone down. So all of you have an incentive to make the university, Fuqua in particular, do better, because the better the Fuqua does, more people are going to think you're smarter than you might really be. So, so all of you, I think, have an incentive to help the school. Fuqua is a school that's relatively young. There are no business schools in the top dozen or so in the United States that are as young as Fuqua. Fuqua was started with a very modest amount of money, and it didn't even exist when I was an undergraduate here. It started in 1972. I graduated in 70. And so in a relatively short period of time, by the way these things are measured, Fuqua has come up. And all of you took a chance on Fuqua. All of you presumably could have done other things. But the fact that you did Fuqua, you now have Fuqua attached to your name for the rest of your life. Whenever you go anywhere, my experience is people ask you three things right away. What's your name? Where are you from? Where'd you go to school? And they judge you by where you go to school to some extent, rightly or wrongly. And what you want to do is have Fuqua be seen as a great school, because it will make people think you're smarter than you are, maybe, or more accomplished. So I hope all of you will give back to Fuqua and to do something that I think is maybe difficult for some people, but to reach in your pocket sometimes, or if you don't have the money, give your ideas, but also help with other people. And the final thing I would say is that when that speech that I referred to about John Kennedy, that was a speech that propelled me to go into public service and really try to do certain things. And that famous line was the line that Kennedy wrote knowing it would be famous. Ask not what your country can do for you. He admired Churchill very much. And Churchill always had a signature line in his speech. And Kennedy always wanted to have one. But Kennedy actually had a signature line, in my view, at the end of that speech. that really, to me, is more significant. And what he said was, with a good conscience, our only sure reward, with history, the final judge of our deeds, let us go forth, asking his blessing and his help, but knowing that here on earth, God's work must truly be our own. Now, all of you, I would say, could help a little bit with God's work if you were to help a little bit with Fuqua. So I hope all of you will recognize that you will be doing God's work by helping Fuqua be even a better school than it already is. But thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
David, thank you so much for what was spectacularly entertaining, informative, and truly wise. We do want to give you a gift. It's a little bit complicated to come up with a gift for someone like you, but we think we're up to the challenge. So we know that you are on your phone a lot.
Right.
So what we have for you is these. I'll give you these and then I'll show you.
Okay.
So what you do is you attach it to the back of your phone, which builds the Fuqua brand, and you
got it.
You carry it everywhere.
Okay. I see.
And then you peel it off and you clean your screen.
I see. Is that what it does? Okay. Well, I appreciate it very much. I can use that, and I will start using it. And I thought it was going to be these cards to call various places around the world. I thought they were calling cards, but this is better. So, thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.